Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. My name is Manvinder Kaur. Today's class is a part of a live series, Love and Justice through Guru Nanak Sahib. This class will begin with a 40-minute lecture, followed by 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So, as mentioned, please drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. Now, I would like to introduce you to today's presenter. Asha Marie Kaur is a research assistant with Sikhi. She is a BA in political science and international studies from Northwestern University. Her work at Sikhi is tied to her love of the Persian language and the way it connects Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Please welcome Asha.
Hi, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to the 5th session of Love and Justice through Guru Nanak Sahib. And today is really exciting because we're going to introduce ourselves to the Guru Granth Sahib. For some people, this will be a familiar session. For others, this may be totally new, but I think everyone's going to get something out of this. I do have to say there is so much content to cover, and I'm trying to squeeze what I learned over the span of many weeks from various experts into what I think is the most important 40-45 minutes. So if you have any questions at all, I think today is a really good time to note your questions and present them, because there's going to be a lot of information coming out here. Even for people who are quite familiar with the Guru Granth Sahib, they might not be familiar with all the little intricacies we're going to get into today. So to begin, we're going to start with the literal words that make up Guru Granth Sahib. By immersing ourselves in these words, we actually have a pretty good roadmap of where we're going here. So the Guru Granth Sahib is a Granth. Granth roughly translates to anthology. So it is the anthology of the Sikhs. It is our primary source for all knowledge, all Sikh knowledge. And this Granth is Guru. It is Guru meaning wisdom, meaning the entity that guides us, the perfect mentor for the Sikhs. So it's the perfect mentor for the Sikhs, but the wisdom of the Guru is such that it's accessible to anyone who seeks this wisdom. So it's not intended to be something that's only accessible by Sikhs or only revealed with Sikhs in mind or compiled with Sikhs in mind. It is the perfect mentor for the Sikhs, but accessible to all who seek wisdom. And then Sahib means sovereign. So the Guru Granth Sahib is sovereign. It is the sovereign entity that we as Sikhs bow down to. It is not to be manipulated or controlled by the sorts of social entities that are involved in a lot of our day-to-day functioning. So it's not meant to be monopolized by, say, a particular nation state, for example. So the Guru Granth Sahib is sovereign, and it's for the sovereign body of the Sikhs to use as the perfect mentor, to look to as the perfect mentor. So, all right. So the Guru Granth Sahib is much more than a holy book, which is kind of the colloquial way a lot of non-Sikhs will speak about it in order to try to align it with the way other religions are spoken about. When we engage with the Guru Granth Sahib, the physical engagement is not like that of engaging with a book either, and we'll talk more about that later. Okay, so we're going to start with a bunch of numbers here. There's a lot of stuff, but these are key numbers to think about when breaking down what all is in the Guru Granth Sahib. So the Guru Granth Sahib is written in one script. That is the Gurmukhi script, which is today used as the Punjabi script in what is Indian Punjab, whereas Shahmukhi, which predates Gurmukhi, is the Arabic script for Punjabi, and that is used in what is now Pakistani Punjab. However, the Guru Granth Sahib is not written in Punjabi. It is written in one standardized script, but the words come from 8 major language groups or clusters. We're going to get into this in the next few slides, but it's really important to think about how the languages of the subcontinent as we know them today, a lot of them had not been developed yet, had not crystallized into their current forms. So for example, we think of Hindi as a major language of North India, but Hindi and its counterpart written in Arabic script Urdu didn't really exist in the forms they exist in today. So a lot of the languages we're talking about are precursors to what we know as modern languages, the things we're more familiar with. And a lot of them are also the various language groups that came out of Vedic texts. So relatives of forms of Sanskrit, forms of Pali, which is another ancient South Asian language that had specific forms because they were used for specific things. So one might write Sanskrit in a more folk manner versus a more literary manner, and then it would get a different name. So sort of the same language, sort of not. The linguistic heritage of the Guru Granth Sahib is very intricate and very complex. There are 2 authenticated sarups of the Guru Granth Sahib. We can think of that as manuscripts or editions, we want to think about it in a modern way. There's 1,430 pages. So the Adi Granth, which is the original anthology, was inaugurated in 1604 after Guru Arjan Sahib compiled it. And then in 1708, the Bani of the 9th Guru was added to the Guru Granth Sahib, and that is when the Adi Granth becomes the Guru Granth Sahib and becomes the sovereign Granth of the Sikhs. In the Guru Granth Sahib, most of the Bani, most of the wisdom in the Guru Granth Sahib, most of the words are in poetic forms, and these poetic forms are assigned a rag. A rag is a type of musical measure from classical South Asian music, and each rag is associated with a particular emotion, a particular state of mind, and it instructs the type of mindset to go into engaging with the Shabad with, and it also informs the musical measure for the Kirtan. So when the word of the Guru Granth Sahib, when the Gurbani of the Guru Granth Sahib takes its musical form, which is what is performed in and revealed in Gurdwaras, in Sikh places of learning and worship, there's a particular musical measure that's supposed to be done in. It doesn't always end up happening in today's day and age, unfortunately, due to gaps in people's preferences or even their ability to get education in rag. So it doesn't always happen that it's presented that way, but the Guru Granth Sahib was revealed with musicology in mind. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Who are the contributors in the Guru Granth Sahib? We've talked a little bit about this. There are 6 gurus, so not all of the gurus contributed to the Guru Granth Sahib. There's 15 bhagats, we talked about extensively. There's 11 butts. These were bards of the era who would write kind of these eulogizing poetic forms about the happenings of their time. A lot of them were from a particular group of Brahmins, and they are more likely to reveal Shabad that talks more specifically about people or places because they're quite literally eulogizing the gurus and describing their qualities and the ways they interacted with their surroundings. So this is something to note, that the Guru Granth Sahib isn't about telling stories per se, it's about describing experiences. So it's a lot less narrative-based than some of the scriptures of, say, the Abrahamic faiths or the Vedas. And both the Vedas and the texts of Abrahamic faiths are referenced in Gurbani, and their structures even talked about that, oh, well, they're trying to give you specific instructions, and that's what Shabad is here for. So it's not very story-based, narrative-based. There's very few people that are mentioned by name in Gurbani, for example. So we're not looking, these are not selections of stories. However, in the poetic forms that are meant to eulogize or praise someone, more specific details may come through that. Then there are 3 Sikhs who contributed, and we will put the specific names up here. Yeah, so these are the Gurus, the Bhagats, the Sikhs, and the Bhakts. The Sikhs were simply devoted followers. So Balwand and Sata were actually Muslim brothers who kind of had a relationship with Sikhi and became Sikhs. So not all the Sikh Gurus are contributors in the Guru Granth Sahib. There's very specific aspects to how Bani is written. So the Bani revealed by the Gurus is the only Bani that invokes the name of Nanak. So throughout this course, we're going to see a Shabad that says, Nanak says, or Oh Nanak. Only the Gurus invoke the name of Nanak because all the Gurus shared the light of Guru Nanak. Guru Nanak Sahib cannot be separated from the other Gurus, so they would use the name of Nanak, if we want to think of it more simply, as a pen name, like a shared invocation that they would all have. And yes, some of the Bhatts are ballad singers from the Vaishnava tradition that eulogize the Gurus in Bani. And having bards who would write ballads about important figures was that was a central part of having a court or having an institution of governance back in the day. So by having this sort of infrastructure and this sort of literary production, this is really asserting the place of Sikhs in governance. So there's a careful and intentional order to Bani. The Guru Granth Sahib is not arbitrarily ordered whatsoever. However, how meticulous the detail is I think something that's not appreciated by most of us Sikhs unless we seek out to specifically study it. So for example, the rags are very intentional. They provide the emotional context. They can entail a particular mood, a feeling, a season, a color, etc. Not all Bani is set within a particular rag. So there are a few pages in the beginning of the Guru Granth Sahib that are before the structure of the rags, and then there's pages at the end as well. As far as terminology, because I know I'm using a lot of terminology that might be kind of difficult to follow for non-Sikhs, but Shabad serves as an umbrella term for verse in the Guru Granth Sahib. And then also is the word for a particular poetic section and has a marked beginning and end. However, some of the poetic sections are particular South Asian poetic forms that have a particular number of lines, a particular number of sections they're supposed to have. So not all, so Ashpati's Chansanvars are Shabads, but they are Shabads, but then they also like have another signifier that we can call them by. So we don't have to get into the real nitty gritty, but for example, a pauri or a stanza, there can be a certain number of pauris that an Ashpati is supposed to have, for example. So there's also an order to the contributors. So first, we have Shabads, and they're ordered by the Gurus. So it starts with Guru Nanak Sahib, and then we go through all the Guru's contributions in that rag until we get to Guru Tegh Bahadur, the 9th Guru. Then, if there's Shabad by the 6th, that goes next. Then, when there's Shabad by the Bhagavats, that goes after that. The Sikhs, for example, don't have contributions that are in every rag. Not every Guru is present in every rag, and not every Bhagat is present in every rag, but if a contributor is present, there's a particular order in which they're supposed to go. So this is very carefully laid out, and there's a reason why all this is so meticulous. Another thing we really need to learn and unlearn. Gurbani is not just Punjabi. Punjabi is historically, culturally, and in a literary fashion very important to the Sikhs. It is the older form of Punjabi that was thriving in the Guru period is highly present in the Guru Granth Sahib, don't get me wrong. But it is actually, if we look at just the percentage of words, it's actually the second most present language in the Guru Granth Sahib. So to say that, oh, if I learn Punjabi, I'll be able to read Gurbani with fluency is a fallacy. It is a popularly held belief, but the language of Gurbani stands on its own. It is extremely fluid. It is often hybridized. So you don't necessarily know when the Persian starts and ends, and then the Sanskrit begins, and then the Punjabi begins. Sometimes you will have whole Shabads that will be extremely fluent in one particular language, but sometimes the language can change line by line, word by word, and new forms of grammar, new forms of pronunciation, new embellishments on language are created throughout Gurbani that you won't see in any other usage even. The language of Gurbani is also redistributive. What this means is that it moves away from the restrictions of language that determine that certain registers had to be disseminated by a ruling class of people. So for example, there are forms of Sanskrit that only the ruling class would get to learn and would get to disseminate. But then there are forms that are more folk-like in nature. Gurbani prioritizes all the colloquial and folk-like forms of language because Gurbani is meant to be engaged with by the common person. So moving away from courtly language and towards the language of the common person. But then, of course, Sikhs built their own governance structures and their own courts, which then took what was considered common or even considered lowly and elevated it back up through language, through music, and through the cultural forms that were expressed. So a really nice way of thinking about Gurbani that I was taught is that you can think of the language of Gurbani like a recording, because you have the musical measure in which it's supposed to be revealed, and the spellings, the pronunciations are those of the common person. So they're written is exactly as they were heard when the Gurus first revealed it, for example. Thirdly, the Gurmukhi script is one of the few scripts, and I think actually even among those few scripts, the most phonetic script in our modern era. So you know exactly how everything is supposed to be pronounced. There's not room for interpretation. So we can really think of this as a very solid recording of what was being revealed at the time. the language is also very intentional. Languages are used to convey a particular message, perhaps a particular emotion, to reach a specific audience, etc. So it's not random that at one point Guru Tegh Bahadur is writing in Braj Bhasha, or Guru Nanak Sahib has revealed Shabad in Persian. These languages are used for particular reasons, and oftentimes you can see particular themes that are invoked when a particular language is used. So to give an idea of the vast diversity of the languages of Gurbani, we have Sadhu Bhasha, also known as Sadhukari, which is a historical literary register of Bengali. We have Punjabi, of course. We have Lendi, which is somewhat more of an umbrella language. The dialects of Lendi, Saraiki, Hindko, Potahari, are all spoken today. Afghan Sikhs speak dialects of Saraiki and Hindko, known both as Hindko but also by the cities that they're from. So I think that Kandhari from Kandahar, spoken by Afghan Sikhs there, is a dialect of Saraiki, for example. And Potahari is spoken in what is now Azad Kashmir, Pakistani administered Kashmir, and KP. So, but all of these languages are oral languages that do not have standardized scripts. And the Lendi script was never standardized either. However, the non-standardized Lendi scripts were the precursors to Gurmukhi. So they were kind of the letters that were looked at and standardized into a script for the Sikhs. We have Braj, or Braj Bhasha, which is a literary register of Western Hindi, and it's still a spoken dialect in a set of rural districts in both Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan. There's Sanskrit, of course, which is the primary liturgical language of Hindu text and practice, but we must remember that Sanskrit was very much held up in positions of power. So people, you had to have quite a deal of social capital, religious capital, a sense of importance in society to be allowed to even learn Sanskrit. There's Farsi in the Guru Granth Sahib, as well as a lot of Farsi loan words that are sprinkled in even when the sentences themselves are not in Farsi. Farsi is the Farsi word for Persian, so these words are in fact interchangeable. It is the form that was used in South Asia in that era. So it is not, there's a lot of differences between the Farsi in the Guru Granth Sahib and that which is spoken today in modern Iran, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, for example. There's also a difference in, there's a lot of differences in sounds. So like I said, this is a recording of how people spoke at the time. So at the time, there was no, people did not make a Z sound that often. They would make a J sound instead. And in fact, the ability to write a Z sound in Punjabi came later. So when we are reading the original Gurmukhi, you'll see in a lot of places, for example, the messenger of death, Azrael, is known as Ajrael in Gurbani. So it's, I work a lot with Persian in the Guru Granth Sahib, and it perplexes Punjabi speakers, it perplexes Persian speakers. I would say the only people that really are able to have a bird's eye view of that and can really fully immerse themselves without having to do extensive study in the Persian of the Guru Granth Sahib are Sikhs who come from both a Persian-speaking and Punjabi-speaking background, like many Afghan Sikhs, for example. So then we also have different dialects that come out of the general Indo-Aryan language family that were often used in specifically religious contexts for specific literary production in religious spaces for the transmission of folk tales, etc. So we have Gata and Prakrit and Abranch, but these are very fluid categories that even linguists don't fully agree on. So these are the kind of the major groups. There's also Marathi and Rajasthani, and now that I think about it, there's also Sindhi in the Guru Granth Sahib as well, to a lesser extent. So that looks a lot like, quite similar to the modern day registers we have in this era. So a lot of languages. There's one thing I want everyone to take away from this class, is that Gurbani does not equal Punjabi. Punjabi is so valuable and so important, but you can be the most astute, wise, fluent Punjabi speaker in the world, and you cannot use that skill alone to engage with Gurbani in its original form. So not all the contributors spoke or wrote in all these languages. I will say that I have found more Bhagats that have known Persian that are on this list, so I would add some of my own modifications. I think another really important thing to note is that Punjab is very central to Sikh history, but our contributors came from all over the subcontinent. So we really shouldn't try to box the history of Sikhi or the creation of Gurbani into a very small geographical area. As much diversity as there could have been was incorporated into the compilation of the Guru Granth Sahib. As we see here, we have contributors from what's now Bengal and Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Sindh. Later on in the Guru period and in Sikh history, our revered Persian poet Bainanwal came from Ghazni, Afghanistan. So Punjab may be the center, but it is not the fullest expanse of where our contributors came from and where our history has grown from. Even in the case of the Punjabi portions of the Guru Granth Sahib, calling it all Punjabi is way too simplistic. This is a map that gives us just a little taste of the amount of Punjabi dialects out there. And, Punjabis like to argue a lot about what the right or wrong way to say things is. The real answer is that there are multiple ways to say things oftentimes, depending on where people come from. So people whose families were forced out of West Punjab during partition speak very different dialects than those whose ancestors have been from East Punjab for as long as I can remember, for example. So moving on to the rags, some people will say that there's 30 rags in the Guru Granth Sahib, and some people will say that there's 60. That's just because some of the rags kind of have sub-rags. So it's not that people are correct or incorrect, just they have a discrepancy in those numbers. But as you can see, there's an immense amount of diversity in the musicology of the Guru Granth Sahib, and just such a careful revelation that this is the emotion that the person felt when they're revealing the Shabad, and that is being gifted to the person engaging with Shabad today. So I think that the musicology of the Guru Granth Sahib is super interesting. Just a little shout out to anyone who might be interested in this topic. There is just so little academic representation on this topic that if you know anyone or you yourself want to go into the study of Sikh musicology, please do it. It would be a dream come true to see people writing their dissertations on this topic. There are, because of a lack of long-standing academic study of the musicology of Gurbani, of the Guru Granth Sahib, there's some things that we've actually lost that we don't know that could be found if someone dedicated immense study to it. For example, there is an indication in the Guru Granth Sahib called Azkar, and we don't know what it means. We don't know if it means a poetic form, a musical notation. We don't have that knowledge, and to rediscover things like that takes a lot of really concerted study and hard work. So getting into notation and formatting. So at the top, there's oftentimes, but not always, an invocation, beginning with Ik Onkar. Then, in every Shabad, you are told what the Rag is and who the Shabad is revealed by. So in this case, it's Bhagat Kabir. Then there are lines within the Shabad, and there are these line breaks with the two lines that look like this. These can either be commas or periods in our punctuation, and the end comes at the end of the pada, at the end of the line. There will be a number to mark, okay, the first line has concluded. The second line has concluded. The third line has concluded. Some of these lines, usually one per Shabad, sometimes more, will say there's a how after them. That indicates a time for pause and reflection. And the Rahal line is usually the thesis statement of the Shabad. So if there's one line you should focus your attention to, it's the Rahal line. And when we discuss what we're getting out of Shabad, oftentimes people will start with the Rahal line as the place to begin their reflection. Then, at the end of the Shabad, you will see a series of numbers. Like I said before, there is a reason why the ordering of the Guru Granth Sahib is so meticulous. This was to make sure that no one was messing with it, and no one was creating invalid and illegitimate copies of it. No one was plagiarizing. No one was trying to edit it for their own, to create their own spin on things. And you have to remember, this was being compiled in, loose leaf at first. So it was very important to keep instead of just page numbers, to keep a constant check on everything. And it also means that as we're engaging with Gurbani, we can always know where we're at. So after each Shabad, there's kind of a number check-in. A check appears throughout the Guru Granth Sahib, and it states the number of verses in the current Shabad, the number of Shabads in the current subsection, and the number of sections in the current Rag. So this is X number Shabad of the 9 Shabads by Guru Arjan Sahib in this Rag, and there's this many Shabads in this Rag, for example. So yeah, this was a way to make sure there was no addition or removal of lines, and you could check that by looking at those numbers. So back to the Rahal lines. If there is one Rahal that represents the thesis statement or the central theme, there's not oftentimes more than one Rahal, but if there are two, then the first presents a question and the second presents an answer. There are 3 Rahal, again, increasingly more rare. The first suggests a motivation. The second describes the attitude of someone who is consumed by ego. And the third suggests a way to overcome the limitation of ego. And if there are more Rahals, then these are just equally important points discussed in a sequence. And perhaps there's a different example, analogy, or explanation that kind of groups the subsections of a Shabad. So that's why you would need many more Rahals to kind of give different central themes. All right. So like I said, the engagement that Sikhs have with the Guru Granth Sahib is far more expansive than the way we would read a book. A big way that Sikhs engage with the Guru Granth Sahib is by taking hukam, hukam being divine command. So these are the instructions as laid out by the Sikh Rath Maryada, which is the code of conduct that describes the lifestyle of those who commit to the Sikh path. So as you can see, even the way we approach the Guru Granth Sahib is as if we're approaching a person, as if we're approaching the person that oversees our sovereign court, our darbar. So the hall in which, in a gurdwara where the Guru Granth Sahib sits, is the darbar hall. It is, which literally means court in Persian. So after kirtan, discourse, elaboration on kirtan and shabad, Sikhs take the hukam and therefore are seeking a reflection in the form of divine command for us to reflect on and absorb into our own lives. So the way a hukam is taken, I thought I had a picture. Okay, I thought I had a picture of this, but I'll try to describe it. So the way a hukam is taken is that whatever is continuing on the top of the left page, you open the Guru Granth Sahib and there's a left page and a right page, has to be read from the beginning. So you may have to flip the page over to get to the beginning. And if it's a var, which is again a type of poetic form, then you would start from the first salok, which is the opening stanza of a poetic form, and the closing stanza. And then go to the salok preceding the pori and read up to the end of the pori. Okay, this is all a lot of detail. So then you would conclude the reading at the end of the shabad where the name Nanak occurs, for example. The reason why I get into all this nitty-gritty is not to intimidate non-Sikhs and say that you have to memorize this or anything. It is to point out that there's a very specific way to take hukam and to read hukam, and actually it's oftentimes when we're explaining things to non-Sikhs, kind of off the cuff, we'll say, oh, yeah, so now they're like opening up to a random page of the Guru Granth Sahib and they're reading that page. It's not actually about reading a page, so that's why I wanted to explain these details. Furthermore, not all shabads will show up as in taking hukam because of the way the formatting of the pages works. I bring this up because, say you go to Darbar Sahib in Amritsar, they will have handwritten sarups of the Guru Granth Sahib, and the spacing is different there. So there are shabads that can show up in hukam that wouldn't show up if you're taking hukam, say, in your home with a machine printed Guru Granth Sahib, but can show up in the handwritten Guru Granth Sahib. So it's just like a cool thing. And then also there's some shabads that show up as the hukam, in my opinion, like all the time. One of my favorite shabads shows up in the hukam of the Darbar Sahib, like feels like once every few weeks. I don't know if that's accurate, it just feels like that because I really love it and I always notice it. So it's not random enough, it's totally possible for human beings to be totally random. And also the mechanics of this process make it not totally random either. So yeah, the hukam has to be taken at the conclusion of Sikh service, for lack of a better term, after the Ardas, which is the supplication that we give, where we recite quite a deal of Sikh history and then also give our supplication of that day. So the hukam is kind of our answer to our supplication. So we put something out there, we ask something, and now we have the hukam, which guides us and commands us, and it is the thing that we we'll ponder to have our answer. Those of you who've been to a Gurdwara have probably eaten deg, or more commonly known as prasad. So the act of eating that offering, which doesn't always have to be, it can come in multiple forms, but it's usually ghee and flour, sugar all mixed up. That's actually you taking the hukam physically. So you're absorbing the hukam. It's meant to be that sort of action, which is why no one is under any obligation to take the deg in a Gurdwara. It is okay to not eat prasad if offered it. Say a non-Sikh from a different faith isn't comfortable doing so. That's okay, because it's only meant to be there if you're ready to absorb the hukam and reflect on that, which, again, you don't have to be Sikh to do, but also you don't have to do it either. All right. I also want to cover a quick note on transcription. We've already seen today a discrepancy in how Shabad is spelled with just an S or an SH. So a lot of Sikhi transcriptions look like unusual or different from commonly available ones. This is because we are really trying to ascribe to a model that can be standardized across transcriptions of South Asian languages. So there are in linguistics specific ways to make sure that there's not repetition or confusion in how things are romanized. There are particular ways to make things look cleaner. So for example, for long vowels, if you have like a ton of double E's and double I's and double A's, it gets kind of unwieldy. So it's a little easier to put a bar above an A to make a long vowel, for example. When you have tones and variations of sounds that only have one corresponding letter in the modern Roman English alphabet, that can become tricky. So we have to be very systematic in how we write things. So that is why things are going to look different sometimes. There's also just plain discrepancies in transcription. Sometimes people write things a certain way, and then when it's written that way, it actually ends up muddling up the meaning and creating confusion about what the original meaning was. So yeah, if you see things that look odd, I promise you there's a reason why we spell it that way. And if that ever comes up as a question, I'm happy to answer it, because it has been my task to write up extensive documents on why we do each thing. So it's not just an us thing, though. We're really trying to follow models that have been provided by scholars and agreed upon in the scholarly community. So the idea is that if we can narrow down one way to do this, then we can actually provide a way for people who don't know Gurmukhi to accurately read Gurbani, even if they're not ready to do it in the original Gurmukhi yet. The cool thing is that Gurmukhi doesn't require all this complex agreements over how to spell things, because Gurmukhi is already 100% phonetic. Yeah, next week we're going to dive into Shabad by starting with the Mool Mantar, which is the opening root verse of the Guru Granth Sahib. We're going to talk about what is the central proclamation revealed by Guru Nanak Sahib, and how do we engage with this proclamation as the central thesis, the nucleus for the Sikh worldview, and all Sikh principles that flowed after this proclamation. All right, so I am happy to take any questions now. And if people need a second to come up with questions, I was also thinking of showing just some really cool examples of the linguistic diversity in Shabad. But let's start to see if anyone has any questions first. Okay, what I'm going to share with everyone, I just think this is a good introduction for people who maybe haven't read a lot of Shabad before, and for those who are very familiar with Gurmukhi script and Gurbani and have read a lot of Shabad, it might be eye-opening as well to the amount of diversity that we have here. Okay, so like I said, there are many languages in the Guru Granth Sahib. Here we have an example of Sadhu Bhasha. The mother realizes that the son grows up, yet she does not understand that life diminishes day by day. Saying, my son, she embraces him closely. The messenger of death looks on and laughs. One takes paper, cuts out a kite that wanders in the sky. One might be talking to the friends, but attention is kept on the kite string. We have Punjabi. Hundreds of moons and thousands of suns rise. Even with so much illumination, there is pitch darkness without the Guru. We have Landi. O black nightingale, which qualities make you black? I have been burnt by separation from my beloved. Without the husband, how can she find peace? When grace occurs, Vaheguru unites. My love is with you. I have observed other loves to be false. The clothes and food are scary, which do not give a glimpse of the beloved. All right.
It does seem like we have some questions. Sorry, Asha.
Okay, great.
I was asking a question before and I realized my mic wasn't working. So apologies.
All right. I was wondering if it was an issue on my end.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to leave you hanging, but we do actually have a couple of questions. From Surinder B. They ask, you said there are no stories in the Guru Granth Sahib. How are the stories of the Gurus passed down then?
Yes. Okay. This is a really good question. So in Guru Nanak Sahib's case, the stories are passed down through the Janam Sakhis. And then, like we discussed in the Janam Sakhis session, the Vars of Bhai Gurdas were not only a key to knowing the details of Guru Nanak Sahib's life, the Vars of Bhai Gurdas talk about all the Gurus leading up to Bhai Gurdas's own life as well. So that's one way that we know stories of the Gurus. As the Guru period progresses, starting with Guru Nanak Sahib, each Guru built institutions. In these institutions, there was a lot of literary and poetic production. So that gives us an idea of stories of what occurred. And then as it progresses even further, we're getting into an era where there's just more accessible historical records. There's more contemporaries that are authors in their own right, that are writing about what's happening. We have eyewitness accounts from travelers, stuff like that. Then there's in Guru Gobind Singh's case, the ghazals of Bhai Nandlal written in Persian. So we have a variety of sources that give us an idea of how the Gurus lived and who they were interacting with, etc., etc. But the Guru Granth Sahib is not meant to be the place where we get caught up in those details. The details would be somewhat of an obstruction to this sort of universal, all-encompassing engagement. But yeah, there's a lot of different sources, and also oral history. There are groups of people, lineages, traditions where stories were meticulously passed down from one generation to the next, and then maybe were only formally written down 100, 200 years later. So, yeah.
Lovely. Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Kirandeep K from London. Maybe you can say a bit more about the structure, the meanings of the rags. So I guess, yeah, just what do rags mean?
Okay, so I'm going to warn everyone that I'm not a musician at all. But a rag is like it denotes the scales that are being used. I have a friend who gave a really, really awesome TED Talk a few years ago on how scales in South Asian music are actually far more diverse than those that we're familiar with coming from a Western standpoint. And then also so for example, Rag Galang, which is where the most famous Persian Shabad of Guru Nanak Sahib is. Rag Talang is supposed to be indicative of someone who is experiencing an intense love, but they're not necessarily seeing it. It's a little bit unrequited, but they're not upset by the nature of it being unrequited because their love is not transactional. So this is how detailed, when I say emotional state, I mean, like these are the types of details we have in here. Or in Rag Asa, which is where Babar Vani is, so where Guru Nanak Sahib is speaking out against the war crimes of Emperor Babar, is indicative of a love so strong that it produces a determination where there's no fear to speak of what you need to speak of to express your love. So that kind of makes sense, right? It makes sense that speaking out bravely against war crimes happened in that rag. So this is the level of intricacy. I know someone in the chat mentioned Raj Academy. Super great source. I definitely recommend looking at it if you want to learn more about Sikh musicology. And also listen, because they have a lot of really great videos. They also talk a lot about the revival of the instruments used in Kirtan in the Guru period, because those of you who frequent Gurdwaras will notice that the main instruments being used are the harmonium and the tabla, neither of which existed in the Guru period. So instruments like the rabab, which Bhaimardana played, Raj Academy is doing a really great job educating people on those instruments and trying to promote resources so that people can learn how to play them. Which Shabad is that? If we're referring to that of Babar Vani about Emperor Babar, we will be discussing that in session 8, and all the Shabads are in that handout. Let me pull up the TED Talk about Rag. I'm doing that right now, and I'll put it in the chat. It's called A Tale of Two Melodies.
Beautiful. Thank you for adding that. Yes, I guess a question that I have, I really appreciated all the detail and how in depth this conversation was, and it kind of illuminated the intricacies and the detail of the Guru Granth Sahib. What particularly I was interested in is when you were talking about the musicology, studying the musicology of the Guru Granth Sahib, and you'd really appreciate if someone would, delve deeper into that. I think before I got into academia, I didn't understand the importance of that. So maybe you could speak a little more to that. Like, what is the importance of studying the details, the musicology of the Guru Granth Sahib? What does that illuminate?
So I think that something we forget is when I say delving into study, I think what comes to mind for a lot of us is delving into study in the form of being at a university. I mean, I myself am in that realm. But that's not what that has to mean. It's unfortunate that we see that as the only venue for deep study. A Gurdwara was supposed to be the type of place where you would go to deeply study the origins of Gurbani, or how to reveal Kirtan and Rag, and how to play Sikh instruments, and how to do various martial arts in our history. Learning of all types, physical learning, musical learning, creative learning, academic learning, historical learning. And unfortunately, a lot of those aspects of gurdwaras have really suffered and kind of been lost in our community and in our history. So when I did Sikri's program Siddhak, which is this kind of, you do like a course and it's also a leadership retreat, the Darbar Hall and the Gurdwara space we had set up there felt like that. It was a revival of that sort of space where it's okay to ask questions. You talk about history in the midst of being in Divan, in prayer. It's okay to go touch the Guru Granth Sahib for the first time if you've never been able to before. It's okay to stumble as you're saying your first ardas or not know how to take a hukam properly. And I think that sort of space where it's okay to make mistakes and learning is prioritized and we can really delve into the precise history of things has really been lost. And so I think it is really powerful for people to go into university spaces to acquire those sorts of skills that allow them to replicate and produce this knowledge. But I don't think we should stick to only doing in that space. I think we should use those spaces as a means of training to then come back into our own communities and set up our own spaces. So I think for me, it's really important because if we're not actively talking about the origins of our knowledge production, then we're only getting the very superficial level of it. And then we can start to get, we're kind of, it's a copy of a copy of a copy, and it becomes a little bit of a game of telephone more than sincere engagement. That's what I think the importance is.
Lovely, amazing. Thank you for lack of a better term, nuancing that, my question and illuminating the different roles that different spaces can take on. I will be wrapping it up now. Thank you everyone so much for all of your questions, for participating week after week. I really appreciate everyone's engagement with this course material. Thank you for all your questions, and I'm so sorry to anyone whose questions weren't answered. Please, do keep them in mind. I will take note of them, and if there's space next time, I'm happy to ask them then. Please tune in for the next week, the 6th week of this live course. Please tune in for our next live webinar as well on June 29th, Rajgarega Khalsa, the Khalsa and the Rule, a conversation on locating the Rajgarega Khalsa motto in the Sikh tradition, its meaning and understanding since the early 1700s. When did this motto become controversial? The why, the what, and the how of the motto's appropriation and its current scenario. And lastly, don't forget to tune into the Sikh Cast, a podcast produced by Sikri, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Again, thank you for joining in today's class. Today's live class will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.